name is this threefold division of the Hebrew scriptures. The Torah, which is the law, the Nebim, which is the prophets, and the Ketubim, which is the writings. And so you kind of put that into in an acronym, and you come out with the Tanakh. But this threefold division is the understanding that Jesus had of the Old Testament, and this was a commonplace during his time, and again, still in our own time. If you open up to Luke chapter 24, verse 44, as the resurrected Christ is walking on the road to Emmaus, and as he is in teaching and instructing, as he appears to the disciples, he said to them, "These are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things which are written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." And some might object, but hey, he doesn't say the writings, he says the Psalms. But notice, what's the first book in the writings? The Psalms. And so he refers to this threefold division, and the emphasis of what we call the prophets, what we're going to be looking at today. The prophets are going to lay out a history, at least the former prophets, and then the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then the book of the 12 are going to comment back upon the history that is laid out in the former prophets. And then the writings are going to emphasize the individual life of faith. And all of those books in the writings begin with the focus upon a single individual. And so we'll look at all of those in time, but I want you to see we're going to focus in on that second column this morning on the former prophets, which are 4 books. Skips over the book of Ruth, which is kind of snuck in there in our English translations, but we're going to be looking at what Joshua, Judges, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel is going to be treated as one book, and 1st and 2nd Kings is going to be treated as one book. So there's 4 books in this portion of Scripture that we're going to be looking at. And I want to draw your attention to how we should understand the relationship between the law and the former prophets that we are jumping into. To begin with, they form one singular narrative. They tell one story. Genesis through Deuteronomy presented to us a history of the patriarchs. And of the first 2 generations of Israel. So we saw the creation of man, the creation of all things in Genesis 1, and the rise of the patriarchs in Genesis, and then Exodus through Deuteronomy is going to tell us the story of Israel, the first generation that was brought out of Egypt in the Exodus, and then the second generation that wandered in the wilderness, and then that generation, their story is going to culminate in the book of Joshua. And then it's going to move forward from there. And the former prophets do not stand on their own, and they depend upon and build upon the Torah. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings continue the historical narrative that began in the book of Genesis. So if you were to take away the Torah, the former prophets wouldn't really make sense. And the expectation is that there is an understanding of what is foundational, and that is those first 5 books of Moses. Now, if you look at Joshua chapter 1, even if you look beginning in verse 1, it refers to the death of Moses. So we're dropping down in, and there's characters and people that we ought to know, and somebody who's passed away. And then verse 6, and this is Yahweh speaking directly to Joshua, "Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land which I swore to their fathers to give to them." Again, those are referring back to all of these things that took place in the Torah. Verse 7, "Only be strong and very courageous, to be careful to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn aside from it to the right or to the left, so that you may be prosperous wherever you go. And this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way successful, and then you will be prosperous. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous, and do not be in dread or be dismayed, for Yahweh your God is with you wherever you go. Now imagine starting a book that way. If you were just to begin reading in Joshua, you would have a whole lot of questions, right? There's so much that is assumed that you know and are familiar with at the beginning of this book and the beginning of the former prophets that we're just picking up and going to continue what we saw in the first 5 books. And as we discussed a little bit previously, at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses is going to present Israel with its future. They're going to tell, he's going to tell Israel what is going to happen. If you turn back just a couple pages to Deuteronomy 31, and again, this is showing the importance of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. If you understand Deuteronomy, everything else will make sense. And as Moses looks forward into Israel's future, he predicts that Israel will go in and they will possess the land that God has promised to them through his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you look at chapter 31, verse 1, so Moses went, go, and Yahweh has said to me, you shall not cross this Jordan. It is Yahweh your God who will cross ahead of you, and he will destroy these nations before you, and you shall dispossess them. And Joshua is the one who will cross ahead of you, just as Yahweh has spoken. And so there's an understanding that they're going to go into the land and they're going to be victorious in conquering the land and subduing the people that are there. But once they possess the land, they will not be able to retain that land. They're not going to be able to hold on to it because they're going to wander away from the Lord. We see this in that very same chapter if you look over at verse 16. And Yahweh said to Moses, behold, you are about to lie down with your fathers, and this people will arise and play the harlot with the foreign gods of the land, and into the midst of which they are going. And they will forsake me and break my covenant, which I have cut with them. And then my anger will be kindled against them in that day, and I will forsake them and hide my face from them, and they will be consumed, and many evils and troubles will find them, so that they will say in that day, is it not because our God is not among us that these evils have found us? But I will surely hide my face in that day because of all the evil which they will do, for they will turn to other gods. So now, write this song for yourselves and teach it to the sons of Israel and put it in their mouths, so that this song may be a witness for me against the sons of Israel. And so Moses is going to speak this prophetic song to Israel so that they would learn it and remember it, and they would keep in mind that God is predicting their betrayal of him centuries before all of it would play out. And letter C there under Roman numeral 2, Moses predicts that Yahweh will judge Israel for their unfaithfulness to the Mosaic covenant. If you just look at verse 20 there in that same chapter, he says, for when I bring them into the land flowing with milk and honey, for which I swore to their fathers, and they have eaten and are satisfied and become fat, then they will turn to other gods and serve them and spurn me and break my covenant. And earlier in the previous chapter, we saw that Moses predicts that multiple times. And he also predicts that that was not going to be God's final action or God's final plan for Israel. Even though that he was going to send them into exile, he was one day going to regather them and give them a new heart and fulfill all of the promises of the new covenant. All of the promises of the new covenant are not there in Deuteronomy, but there's hints and sprinkles of them as it speaks about circumcision of the heart. And so all of this was laid out in Deuteronomy. And then the former prophets are going to record the actual history that unfolds as Israel goes into the land. So when we talk about Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, we're looking at the entire time that Israel is in the land before the exile in those 4 books. That's going to cover 820 years. And as those books are written, they are written in light of what Moses said in Deuteronomy. If you turn over to 2 Kings 17, which is a very important chapter, that chapter is going to be really the final chapter of the northern kingdom of Israel's existence. And we have a prophetic commentary on why they were driven from the land. And ultimately, the author of Kings says that they were driven from the land because of their idolatry. They turned away from the Lord, and they broke the Lord's covenant, the covenant that they made with Yahweh, their God. If you look at 2 Kings 17, beginning in verse 7, now this happened because the sons of Israel had sinned against Yahweh, their God. If you look at verse 6, the LSB has a heading there, just Israel was exiled to Assyria. The kingdom of Assyria comes and conquers the northern 10 tribes, and they are scattered to the wind. And peoples from other lands are brought in, and you're going to see the beginning of the Samaritans in the same chapter. But all of this happens because of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their God, picking back up in verse 7, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and they had feared other gods, and walked in the statutes of the nations whom Yahweh had dispossessed from before the sons of Israel, and in the statutes of the kings of Israel which they had made. And the sons of Israel did things secretly which were not right against Yahweh their God. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in all their cities, and from watchtower to fortified city. And they set for themselves sacred pillars and Asherim on every high hill and under every green tree. And there they burned incense on all the high places, as the nations did, which Yahweh had taken away into exile before them. And they did evil things, provoking Yahweh to anger. And they served idols, concerning which Yahweh had said to them, you shall not do this thing. And Yahweh warned Israel and Judah by the hand of all his prophets and every seer, saying, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and which I sent to you by the hand of my slaves, the prophets. However, they did not listen, but stiffened their neck like their fathers, who did not believe in Yahweh their God. And they also rejected his statutes and his covenant, which he cut with their fathers, and his warnings with which he warned them. And they followed vanity and became vain, and went after the nations which surrounded them, concerning which Yahweh had commanded them not to do like them. And so you see in that passage, they were taken out of the land because they were doing all of the same things as last week when we looked at Joshua. Why did God send Israel into the land of Canaan to destroy the people? Talk to me. Why did God, what was Israel to be in that instance in going in and conquering the land? Yeah, it was God's instrument of judgment upon the Canaanites for their idolatry. But now, the northern tribe of Israel here in this context is doing all of the same things. So what is the Lord going to do? He's going to send another nation to judge the Israelites in the same way that he previously used the Israelites to judge another nation. And when the southern kingdom of Judah is going to do the same thing, God's going to do the same thing with the kingdom of Babylon, sending them in to judge Israel. And so we see a lot of how God works in human history, using one nation to judge another nation. Now, just with that fact, can we speak definitively on when that is actually happening? No, we don't get to go that far. That's God's prerogative, and we can see things later on, but we can't say in the moment of, oh, God is doing this, and he is judging this nation for its wickedness. It's like, no, we need to wait and see, and we will know more in the future. But you also see in this passage that there was a long line of prophets. There was a long line of God's servants who were sent, and how did Israel respond to that long line of servants? They hardened their heart. They stiffened their necks. They refused to listen. And that's going to be where the history that we read about in the former prophets, the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, and there's going to be even others that we see in the former prophets of Elijah and Elisha, and Nathan and others who speak to the kings in our prophetic voices there in Israel. That long line of prophets is ignored by the people of Israel, and God is going to judge them for their violation of the Mosaic covenant. And over time, the Mosaic covenant is slowly going to be kind of intermixed or interconnected with the Davidic covenant. And in 1 Samuel, the people of Israel are going to say, we want a king. And that's going to be a big moment because prior to that, in Joshua and Judges, the nation of Israel was a theocracy. God was at the head of the nation, but then they say, we want a king. It's in essence a rebellion. We want to depose the current king, and we want a new human king. That's where when Samuel hears that in 1 Samuel 8, he's greatly distressed. But God says, no, Samuel, don't be distressed. They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. But even with that, God's going to raise up for himself a king, King David. And then in 2 Samuel 7, there's going to be a covenant that God makes with David and promising him a descendant to reign upon the throne for all time. But there's still kind of under the auspices of the Mosaic covenant, now the obedience of the king is connected to the blessing and the curse. So previously, the blessing and the curse was given to the nation. If the nation would obey and follow God, they would be blessed. And if they disobeyed, they would be cursed. And now, because there's a king, if that wherever the human king goes, the nation is going to follow. So if they have a faithful human king who's going to obey and fear Yahweh, it's going to go well with them in the land. But they have a human king who's going to go his own way, then there's going to be curses that come upon the land. And that's what we see throughout the former prophets. But even though the king's obedience to the Mosaic covenant will either bring blessing or curse upon the people, the line of David is not going to be wiped out because God has promised to build him a house. And we are intended to see that because in 1 Kings, just after the kingdom divides, so there's the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, there's like 3 different dynasties in the northern kingdom that are completely wiped out. They last 2 or 3 generations, and God judges them for their sins. And those northern dynasties aren't any less sinful than the southern kingdoms, but what has God promised in the kingdom of Judah? That a son of David, a descendant of David, would always sit on the throne. And so we're going to see contrasts there. If you turn over to the second page, where you see kind of the structure of these prophets. That these four books give a narrative that covers 820 years. And over the course of the books, there's going to be kind of a pinnacle or a peak structure to the narrative. In Joshua, you're going to see them conquering the land, kind of steadily moving forward. And in Judges, we're going to see a steady movement forward towards a king. The refrain at the end of Judges is, why is everybody doing whatever they wanted to in the land? Yeah, they did what was right in their own eye, but there's another statement there. It says, because there was no king. See, Judges firmly establishes, and it's supposed to be hinting of there is a need for a righteous king to lead Israel. Right? They have these judges, but the judges keep getting worse and worse. And so even though there's this theocracy in the land where the people are supposed to be submitting to and following Yahweh, but because they don't have a regenerate heart and they're all going their own way, it's not working out. There needs to be a king in the land. They need a good and faithful king. And ultimately, when they try and establish their own king, Saul, and how do they elect Saul? Yeah, he's tall and good looking. Let's follow that guy, which is not really going to work out so well later on. And then because Saul does really the same thing that everybody else does. He follows his own heart. And God is going to say, okay, I'm going to establish my king. My chosen one is going to be David. And so there's going to be a lot there within that need for a kingdom. And then the pinnacle of Israel is going to be seen in the reigns of David and Solomon. The United Kingdom. There's ultimately only going to be 3 kings of the United Kingdom: Saul, David, and did I say Jonathan or Solomon? Okay, I said Solomon. And so those are going to really be the pinnacle years of Israel. And then after that, the kingdom is going to divide. and it's just going to be a decline within all of those things. And so that's what you're seeing in the overall structure of these four books. And the quarter marker in the former prophets is Judges 17. If you turn there, Judges 17, as we'll see next week, chapters 1 through 16 in Judges are sequential, and they go through the cycles of the judges, kind of following along a chronology. And in Judges 17 through 21, you have and kind of a portion that's just topical. It's not going to be ordered chronologically. It's there to show us. So 1 through 16 shows us how progressively things got worse and worse. But 17 through 21 show us exactly how bad things got. And what we see beginning in chapter 17 of Judges is there is a presence of idolatry on a more significant level than previously. So Joshua, what his final words to the people of Israel is like, hey, you can't serve the idols and God. And so what's that famous charge that he has that you probably have on your doormat? As for me and my house, yeah, we will serve Yahweh. And he issues that because he knows what's going to take place. And really, within the same couple of generations after that, we see what takes place in chapters 17 through 21, where you're going to have a Levite who goes, and he's going to be the priest for a tribe in Israel, the Danites, and he's going to lead them in apostasy. He's going to lead them in worshiping an idol of their own making. And so we are to read this and to be utterly appalled that a Levite's not worshiping Yahweh, he's worshiping an idol, and he's leading a whole tribe of Israel out and away from worshiping Yahweh. And so we see how bad things get. And so there is overt idolatry. And during 1st and 2nd Samuel, during the reigns of Saul and David, the idolatry kind of takes a back seat. It's not as prevalent as what we see in Kings. It's still there. That's what we need to see and understand. But the emphasis is more upon the life of David and how God is working in him and through him to bring him to the throne. And so David and Saul both had to deal with idolatry, and Solomon introduced and championed a syncretism that led Israel astray in the next generation. And so the halfway point is going to be the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7. I know we're just flying through these things now. We'll talk more about them in depth. That's going to be the halfway point concerning how God, the former prophets. And then the three-quarter point, we'll talk more about the Davidic covenant when we talk about 2 Samuel. But the 1 Kings 12 is the other three-quarters point. So you have the idolatry in Judges 17 that becomes a bigger forefront issue. You have the Davidic covenant, which is the pinnacle of the narrative of the former prophets. And then in 1 Kings 12, idolatry is really going to re-enter into the picture, and it's going to be a main issue that's going to be battled. And the reason the idolatry becomes a main issue in 1 Kings 12. 1 Kings 11 is the death of Solomon, and then his son Rehoboam takes the throne, and the kingdom is going to split under Rehoboam, where he had a choice of does he listen to the older counselors and the older advisors that advised his father, or does he listen to the young men of his own generation concerning how he should proceed? And he says, I'll just listen to the young men, and I'll be harsh with the people. After years and years of large, expansive building projects under King Solomon, he says, hey, I'll just continue to crush the people. And they ultimately rebel, and that's where the kingdom splits. And when the kingdom splits, the king, the leader of the uprising, is a man named Jeroboam. All right, it's like, God, why did you have to have two guys with similar names leading the kingdoms at that exact time? Right, just wait for Joram and Jehoram. You're like, and later on in 2 Kings, you're like, oh, how do I keep track of all this? But if you look at 1 Kings 12 and beginning of verse 25. So now there's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom, but where is the temple? It's in Jerusalem. It's in the southern kingdom. And so Jeroboam is saying, I have a problem. If the people of the northern kingdom are continually going down to the southern kingdom to worship, they're going to be kind of in the king of Judah's control and jurisprudence. And so because he doesn't want his people going to worship in another country, this is what he does. Verse 28 in 1 Kings 12. So the king took counsel and made 2 golden calves. Now, where have we heard of golden calves before? Right? Where does he get this idea? Again, building upon what's taken place in the past. And he said to them, is it too much for you to go up to Jerusalem? Behold, your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. That is the exact phraseology that Aaron said to the people in Exodus 32. So Jeroboam is basically going to lead the northern kingdom of Israel into this syncretistic worship. He's going to say, hey, we're following and worshiping Yahweh, but we're going to do that through idols. We're going to do that through graven images and kind of trying to merge different faith systems. Verse 29, and he set one in Bethel, and he put one in Dan. And now this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan, and he made houses on high places and made priests from among all the people who were not of the sons of Levi. Again, another affront. God has chosen and set apart the Levites to be his priests, and Jeroboam says, well, I'll just make priests who are not from that tribe. And Jeroboam made a feast in the eighth month on the 15th day of the month, like the feast which is in Judah, and he went up to the altar, and thus he did in Bethel to sacrifice to the calves which he had made, and he had the priests of the high places which he had made stand in Bethel. And he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel, and on the 15th day of the month, even in the month which he had devised in his own heart. There's a poignant statement. And he made a feast for the sons of Israel and went up to the altar to burn incense. I don't want them going to Israel to celebrate. I believe that's the Passover there. I want them to go to Dan or to Bethel to sacrifice and to worship. But it was really something that he devised in his own heart. And if you remember, we read Kings just a couple months ago. There was always that evaluation of each king. Right, the northern and southern kingdoms, and the northern kingdoms, they all were idolatrous and unfaithful to Yahweh. But they would say, but he walked in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, meaning that he worshipped as Jeroboam worshipped. He worshipped these golden calves rather than following after Yahweh. Now, added into that a little bit later is going to be Baal worship, which was introduced by Omri and Ahab and Jezebel, and the prophets of Baal. And so you're going to have all of this syncretistic worship creeping in. And hey, we can worship both all at once. And God says, no, any form of syncretism is condemned profoundly in the Old Testament. And that's one thing when you talk about when we come to the New Testament and what we're studying in the Gospels, the Jews at that point in time understood why they were exiled from the land. It was because of their idolatry, and they didn't keep the Sabbath. But what's amazing is they were cured of their idolatry at that point, but what did they turn the Sabbath into? An idol. That's what they worshiped, and that's what they began to do all this ritual towards, knowing and swinging to another other side of the pendulum, so to speak. But so those are the major sections and the major story of idolatry in the former prophets. And the former prophets, I'm on the third paragraph there at the top. The former prophets give a limited history, just like the Torah. They were not intended to give every detail about Israel or everything that we would possibly want to know. Now, it is interpreted history, just like every other history, and it is a theological interpretation of Israel's history. So we're not given all of the details that we would want, right? I'm sure you read certain things, you're like, okay, how did that, I want to know more. But this is a survey because, again, 820 years covered in these 4 books. That's really, really fast, right? If you were to read a history of the United States of America, it would probably be much longer than Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and that would cover a period of about 250 years. We're close to that. So just think about that. 820 years packed, condensed down into these few pages. There is a lot left out. And the Torah and the former prophets are key to understanding the latter prophets. So if you want to understand Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 better, then read through Genesis through 2 Kings, and you'll understand the historical context of what those prophets are commenting upon and speaking into. And so that's really, really important to grasp. The former prophets expose Israel's historical idolatry and rebellion, and the latter prophets are not only going to indict the law-breaking of Israel and Judah, but they are also going to predict Yahweh's restoration of Israel. So the former prophets are kind of just saying, like, this is the rise and fall of Israel. And here's the prophetic commentary on it. And even though we're talking about the rise and the fall, the prophets are going to say, God is going to judge us, but he's going to restore us in the end days. And he's going to bring about salvation for us and for all the nations through his promised Redeemer. So that's what we see in the former prophets. If you look at that table at the bottom, you have Joshua and Judges kind of treated together. It's about 45 chapters, covers about 350 years from 1406 to 1055, and that time Israel was a theocracy. If you look at Kings, it's almost identical, right? You have 47 chapters, and you have about 350 years being covered from 915 to 561, and those are the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And again, we talked about part of the ways that there is emphasis created in the Bible is the slowing down of time. Right? When things are covered really fast and really quickly, it's not so much of an emphasis. But when time slows down, an emphasis is placed upon this time period, these characters, these individuals. So the major portion, half of the former prophets, focuses in on the unified monarchy. The lives of Saul, David, and Solomon. And the central figure in this entire portion of Scripture is David. He is going to be the central character and the most important character. And then also in Kings, at the end of 1 Kings and into 2 Kings, time slows down, and you have this focus upon the ministries of Elijah and Elisha. So again, take note of that. Like when things were clipping along, and I just have like 2 or 3 paragraphs about a king, and another 2 or 3 paragraphs, and it's just like going and going. Think about that. All that was worthy of being mentioned in this interpretive history is like this guy was king from this time to this time. He didn't follow the Lord, and that was it. That's all that's worth mentioning. But then there's other things mentioned about others. So keep that in mind. If it's a selective history, what's going to be selected is what is most important. On the top of page 24 now, it's also interesting to note that each of those books begins with the notation or the implication of death. So Joshua 1 begins with the mentioning that who just died in Joshua 1? Moses, the man of God that God had been working through for the last 40 years and leading Israel. In Judges 1, it's Joshua who died. In 1 Samuel 1, we have to make a little bit of some connections. Judges kind of introduces a new judge with a saying, there was a certain man. And the last time we saw that was in Judges 13:2. And that was introducing us to the final judge that we see in the period of the Judges, or in the book of Judges, not the period of the Judges. But we saw Samson, chapters 13 through 16, and then 17 through 21. Again, it jumps out of the chronological movement, and it jumps over to topical. And then 1 Samuel 1 begins with, now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim in the hill country of Ephraim, and we're going to be introduced to Elkanah and his wife Hannah. And the implication, because we're moving on and that same phrase is used, we're moving now into the story of the final judge, Samuel. And the implication there is that Samson has died. And he has been unfaithful to finish up what he was supposed to do, and Samuel is going to actually finish dealing with the Philistines as Samson should have. But there's this implication of death, and then in 1 Kings, you have King David on the decline. That he's old and he's not doing well. At 1 Kings 1. So each book begins with a notation or an implication of death. Then there's an extended narrative that comprises most of the book. And then each book has an epilogue. And you see that the references there, kind of a summary statement of what took place and an evaluation of what has happened. So again, interesting that they all follow that same pattern. Key themes in the former prophets. First and foremost, God. God is the only character there at the beginning and the only one there at the end. Every other human being has passed away over the course of 820 years, but God is there and present throughout everything. And he begins, this portion begins with Yahweh speaking to Joshua. He is the central figure. He is presented repeatedly as the warrior. He is the one who leads Israel in victory going into the land. We saw that in Deuteronomy 31. Moses says, hey, you're going to go into the land, and it's because Joshua is such a good and amazing general that you're going to be able to conquer. Is that what he said? Or did he say, no, you're going to go in and possess the land because Yahweh is fighting for you? That is the only way that you're going to go in and be victorious. And ultimately, every time Israel wins, it's because Yahweh won the battle. And every time they lose, it's because Yahweh wasn't fighting the battle for them, right? And we see that really clearly and obviously in Joshua. What do we see? Back-to-back chapters. They defeated, what was the strongest city in the area that they defeated? And the walls came tumbling. Yeah, Jericho. And then they lose to Ai, right? And why did they lose to Ai? Because God wasn't with them, because there was covenant unfaithfulness. So that's, again, this pattern is seen over and over again in the former prophets. That if Yahweh is fighting for somebody, they will win no matter what. And if he's not fighting for them, then they're going to lose. They're going to be defeated. God is also held up as the righteous judge. And when God doesn't fight for Israel, he's doing so righteously, and he's righteously judging sin. He says, okay, if you want to rebel, if you want to go and do this on your own, then that's what you're going to get to do. All right, you can go up and fight Ai. Let's see what happens. All right, but God is also going to judge righteously. Now, and what took place with Achan, the man who stole things that were under the ban, and in Hebrew they were korban. They were, in essence, things being under the ban, meaning that they were dedicated to God. And that was the emphasis, and that's also where Jesus in the Gospels is going to condemn the Pharisees, because the Pharisees use that as a loophole. They say, oh, well, this is korban. I dedicate this to God, and I don't have to use this money to care for my parents. And that's where he says, no, this is wicked. You're saying it's devoted to God, but you're abusing what God is commanding. And so there's a lot here, but God is the righteous judge, and he is also the one who blesses for obedience and curses for disobedience. And we see this over and over again, and it builds upon what we saw in the Torah, in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. And if you go through and you see all of the curses, go read Deuteronomy 28, and you'll see all of the curses unfolding as Israel is disobedient in the former prophets. And that is just heartbreaking to read through and be able to piece together. But a second major theme is the monarchy. And the former prophets are going to introduce the concept of kingship. And Joshua goes in and he has conquered kings in Joshua 12. And again, in Judges, there's the need for the king, that all of them were going their own way because there was no king in Israel. And it's interesting to think that really Joshua is going to be a model king before there's a king. If you think back in Deuteronomy 17, Moses had made preparations for a king in Israel. In Deuteronomy 17, he says, the future king of Israel is going to need to do what? he's going to need to make a handwritten copy of the law, the first 5 books of Israel. So youth students, that's your assignment for this month. Hand copy Genesis through Deuteronomy and keep it with you and meditate on it day and night. That's what the king was supposed to do. And the priests were to check his work. He said, you didn't print this well. There's a smudge here. Write this over. But that was the assignment of the king, and they were to meditate on it day and night. And then we get to Joshua 1, and what's Joshua supposed to do? We read it earlier. He's supposed to meditate on the law day and night, and he's to act and live accordingly, to be strong and courageous. And Joshua is going to really kind of be until we have David, he's going to be the picture or the model of what a future king should look like. And then we're going to have God's choice for the king, which is going to be the life of David, which is going to really be the emphasis there of the former prophets. And he is really the central figure in the Old Testament. And so much of the Old Testament was about David or written by David. You think about how many of the Psalms, how much of not only this portion of the former prophets, but even circling back around to Chronicles. I think I skipped this point, but yeah, Genesis through 2 Kings presents one continuous narrative. It forms one continuous history of Israel, and that's the primary history. And then Chronicles is going to be like a secondary or supplemental history. And Chronicles is going to be different because Chronicles doesn't begin where Joshua begins. Chronicles begins with Adam. It goes all the way back to creation and then gives out a history as well, but it goes much, much faster. But it's going to cover the same period and extend a little bit further into the post-exile. But there's a lot there. But we see the monarchy is a major theme. We see the cities of the kings as a major theme. So much is going to transpire in Gibeah, where Saul lived, and in Bethlehem, where David was born and was raised, and then Jerusalem, which is going to be where David establishes his monarchy, and then that's where David is going to build, or Solomon's going to build the temple, and that's where the capital city of the southern kingdom is going to be. Also in the northern kingdom, I didn't put it on there, but the capital city is going to be Samaria, and that's going to be important in terms of, as you read through the latter prophets, there will be times where the prophets just speak against Samaria, and you're like, why are they talking about Samaria? Well, if you understood Samaria is the capital city, you understand the bigger context. Like if somebody spoke against Washington, D.C., what are you understanding about Washington, D.C.? The political government located there is far more important than just the physical land. So that's a theme here. And then the servants of Yahweh, the servants of the Lord, are also a recurring theme. And that phrase is not given to everybody, but it's used to describe Moses as the servant of Yahweh. It's used to describe Joshua, David, Elijah, and Jonah. And then also, as we read in 2 Kings 17:13, God, in speaking and saying, this is, he refers to the prophets as his, the LSB puts it as my slaves. My slaves, the ones that I have sent forth to proclaim judgment and justice to you, you have rejected. And so God, in speaking about his servants, you have prophetic voices who are going to speak into the lives of the kings. And really the prophets that are sent by God are going to be more important than the kings. The prophets sent by God are the ones who are going to be accountability for the kings, right? What did Nathan do in the life of David? He called David to the carpet using a parable, right? He knew that David had sinned and was covering it up, and he tells a parable, and he says, you are the man, David. And that was the role of the prophet, to be the king's accountability, because as the king goes, so goes the whole nation. And so there's a lot there to see this recurring theme of God is having a prophetic voice in the land, and that's going to be developed over the course of these books. So does that all make sense? I know we went through that really quickly. Questions, cries of shock, confusion, outrage? You know? Yep. Yeah, good questions. So what was asked is, I didn't mention the priests very much. And what about them? I'm saving that for Chronicles because what you have in the former prophets and what you have in the history of Kings and Chronicles are very parallel. Kings is going to be a prophetic history. The emphasis is going to be on the prophets, what they're doing, how they're commenting on what's taking place. The Chronicles is really a priestly history. It's really focusing in on the temple and what's taking place there, and so that's the emphasis. And so I'm kind of saving a little bit. I got to leave some nuance for Chronicles. Otherwise, it's just all the same things. But that's where I want to leave the emphasis of those books to be what the authors emphasized. But yeah, Christ does fulfill those offices, and also in Kings, there's times where God allows a king like David to be prophet, priest, and king, right? God got upset with Saul for offering sacrifices, but David is allowed to. That is significant. That means something. I think it's Uzziah in 2 Kings 6, I think, who comes and offers incense in the temple, and the priests are like, don't do this. And he's like, no, I can do this, and God strikes him with leprosy. Actually, no, you can't. You can't assume those offices if you're not given that privilege and priority. What we'll also see is Joshua kind of meets that as well, of prophet, priest, and king. And again, the prophet is one who represents God to the people. That God speaks to the people through the prophet. A priest kind of goes the other direction. That a priest comes on behalf of the people to represent them before God. Again, we saw that a couple weeks ago. But when the priests are unfaithful, they're coming and representing unfaithfulness on behalf of the whole nation. And then the king speaks with an authority that is with a political authority over the land. And again, that's where Christ fulfills all three of those offices of prophet, priest, and king, and that's going to be significant. So does that answer your question a little bit? We'll leave that for Chronicles on that. What are the questions? So a lot of scripture here. We're going to cover each of these books individually in the coming weeks. But anything kind of on the overview? Mike? Good questions. The question was, why are Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, why are those considered in the writings rather than as a part of the prophets? And I was actually just talking with Tim Carnes about this, so I have his answer on this, but he made a really good point. Daniel wasn't a prophet by occupation. Daniel was a government official. And so what you have in the latter prophets, all of those men were like prophets by occupation. They're going to have other roles as well. Like I think Ezekiel was a priest, and so you're going to see kind of a mixture in some of those. But for the most part, they were called and set apart to speak to the nation and to be covenant commentators or enforcers. And Daniel is not that. He's a government official who does speak prophetically at times, but that wasn't his main role. And then Ezra is going to be a priest, and he's going to be a teacher and an instructor, but he doesn't necessarily speak prophetically in that way. But there's also books written by prophets that are in the writings. And the writings, as we'll talk about later, they focus in upon the individual. Again, we talked about former prophets. Each book begins with death. Each book in the writings focuses in on a certain individual, what they did, how they lived. And there's, in the writings, you have a tremendous encouragement for Old Testament saints that this is what it looks like to live a life faithful to God, and that seems to be the emphasis. So even though Lamentations is written by Jeremiah and is very much a prophetic book, both commenting on what has just taken place in the destruction of Jerusalem, but also looking forward to, okay, God is not done with us, and his mercies are new each morning, and he hasn't cast us aside completely. But that's written by Jeremiah, but it's considered a part of the writing. So they have their own kind of division on things. And there's a lot there to just make note of the connections within the books. But good question. What are the questions? If not, I'll bank this time for later. Okay? Any other questions? Confusion? Cries of shock? Let the record show I have 4 minutes of bankable time. And let me close in prayer, and then we'll get ready for the worship service. Father, we thank you for the way that you have worked in history, the way that you have worked in the lives of your people. And Lord, even though all of these things in the Old Testament, that they were not written directly to us, you have told us in the New Testament that they were written for us. They were written for our benefit, that we would learn from the mistakes, that we would learn from the sins committed by those who have gone before us. That we would not crave evil as they craved, that we would not follow after the same sins that they did. We have a way of repeating the sins of previous generations. So, Father, I pray that you would work in our hearts, that you would use your word to instruct us, to make us aware of what has come before us, that we would be weary, that we would be wise, that we would not follow in their footsteps, but that we would follow after you with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. That you would continue to use your word to instruct us, to give us hope and encouragement by all that has taken place before us, and that we would be courageous, that we would be strong as we meditate upon your word day and night, and that you would use your word to equip us for every good work and prepare us to be instruments in your hands. Lord, we long to be your servants. One day we long to hear, well done, good and faithful servant, even as Moses and Joshua and David and Elijah and Elisha heard from you. Men of faith, Lord, we long to have that same assessment. May you use your word to increase our faith, to grow us, to shape us. We pray that you would use us in a similar way. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, you guys are dismissed. We'll see you in a bit for the service.